The document was crumpled in Minnie Redmond's fist when she slammed it down onto the heavy oak desk, and the sound rang through the small land office like a gunshot on a quiet Sunday morning. "This deed is legal," she said, her voice low and trembling not with fear but with something far more dangerous, the white-hot certainty of a woman who had crossed 4 states on a rattling train and a bone-jarring stagecoach to stand in this exact spot. "My uncle left this land to me. Every acre. Every blade of grass. Every water right attached to it. And I am not leaving until someone in this town acknowledges that." The land registrar, a small man with ink-stained fingers and a collar that seemed too tight for his neck, looked over her shoulder rather than at her face. She knew why. She had known why from the moment she walked through the door of the Harlan County Land Office, and every man inside had gone very, very still. Lewis Barlow was standing at the back of the room. He was taller than she expected from the descriptions people had given her. Broad through the shoulders in the way that came not from vanity but from years of hard labor, from dragging fence wire and throwing hay bales, and doing the 1,000 brutal tasks a cattle ranch demanded. His hat was pushed back slightly on his head, dark hair damp at the temples from the late summer heat of 1882, and his eyes, a pale, startling gray, were fixed on the deed on the desk with an expression she could only call controlled fury. He did not raise his voice. That, she would learn later, was the most frightening thing about Lewis Barlow. He did not need to. "Miss Redmond," he said, stepping forward, his boots slow and deliberate on the wooden floor. "I have no doubt your uncle left you a deed. I have no doubt you believe it is valid. I am telling you, with every respect I can offer a woman who just arrived on the afternoon stage, that the land you are claiming has been mine for 3 years. Then one of us is holding a forgery," Minnie said. The word landed in the room like a thrown stone, and for one suspended moment nobody breathed. "Yes," Lewis Barlow said quietly, his gray eyes moving from the deed to her face with an intensity that made her feel uncomfortably seen. "One of us is." It was August of 1882 in Harlan County, Texas, and the land she had come to claim was called the Redmond Parcel, 700 acres of good grazing grass along the Cimarron Fork, with water rights that made it worth 3 times its surveyed value. And neither of them was going to walk away from it easily. But how Minnie Redmond had come to stand in that land office, white-knuckled and shaking with conviction in a town she had never visited before, required going back to the beginning. Back to a letter that arrived on a cold March morning in her small rented room in St. Louis, Missouri, and changed everything she thought she knew about her family, her future, and the meaning of belonging somewhere. She had been 24 years old in March of 1882, working as a seamstress in a dress shop on Market Street, the kind of respectable but quietly desperate work that kept a woman fed but never quite warm. She had no family left to speak of. Her parents had died of fever when she was 17, leaving her to the uncertain charity of distant relatives who had long since made clear that charity had its limits. She had been largely alone for 7 years, and she had learned to carry that loneliness like a piece of furniture, something you arranged around rather than moved. The letter came from a lawyer in Harlan, Texas, a Mr. Aldous Hatch, who wrote in a formal, looping hand that her uncle, one Clarence Redmond, had died in February without a wife or children, and had left his land holdings in Harlan County to his only surviving blood relative, her. There was a deed enclosed. There were water rights documents. There was a surveyor's map of the parcel. There was also a bank note for $40 for travel expenses, which suggested that Clarence Redmond had, at the end of his life, meant exactly what the deed said. Minnie had held the letter for a long time, sitting on the edge of her narrow bed with the cold March light coming in gray through the window. She had met Clarence Redmond exactly twice in her life, both times when she was very small, a red-faced man who smelled of tobacco and wore boots that were always dusty regardless of the weather. Her mother had spoken of him occasionally, in the careful tone reserved for family members who were loved at a distance. He had gone west before the war and never really come back east. She had written back to Aldous Hatch immediately. She had confirmed her identity, provided the documentation he requested, and received a second letter 6 weeks later confirming that yes, the deed was registered in the Harlan County land records in her name, Minnie Redmond, and she was welcome to take possession at her earliest convenience. It had taken her until August to save enough beyond the $40 to make the journey practical. She had given notice at the dress shop with a heart that felt, for the first time in years, like it was reaching rather than contracting. She had packed one trunk and one smaller bag, taken the train from St. Louis to Kansas City and then to Dodge City, and from Dodge City the stage south into the Texas Panhandle territory toward Harlan. The journey had taken 12 days in total, and by the end of it she was bruised, dusty, and more determined than she had been when she started, which was saying something considerable. She had not expected Lewis Barlow. She had not expected any of what happened after she walked into that land office either, but she had especially not expected Lewis Barlow. After the confrontation over the deed, the land registrar, a Mr. Percy Gill, she learned, had suggested, in a voice that communicated deep personal discomfort with the entire situation, that both parties might want to take a day to review their respective documentation before any formal dispute was filed. It was clear to Minnie that Percy Gill knew Lewis Barlow well, and was hoping the problem would somehow resolve itself between the afternoon stage arriving and the following morning. Lewis Barlow had looked at her with those pale gray eyes and said, "Where are you staying, Miss Redmond?" "I haven't arranged that yet," she admitted. Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth exactly, but something that acknowledged she was a person rather than merely an obstacle. "The Harlan Hotel is on the main street. Mrs. Pryor keeps it. Tell her Lewis sent you. She'll see you settled." "I don't want anything from you," Minnie said. "It's not from me," he said. "It's from a woman who rents rooms. I'm just giving you her name." He picked up his own hat from the rack by the door, settled it over that dark hair, and walked out into the August afternoon without looking back. Through the window, she watched him cross the main street in long, unhurried strides and disappear around the corner of the feed store. She stood there for a moment, holding her deed and her indignation, and then she picked up her bags and went to find the Harlan Hotel. Mrs. Pryor was a wide, sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who wore her gray hair in a severe bun and ran her establishment with the efficiency of a military command. She gave Minnie a room on the second floor with a window that looked out over the main street and the long flat country beyond, grass and sky, and a line of cottonwoods along the creek that wound through the east side of town. She provided a pitcher of water and a towel and supper at 7 o'clock in the dining room. "You're the one with the Redmond deed," Mrs. Pryor said, not as a question. "Word travels fast," Minnie said. "Small town," Mrs. Pryor replied, setting down the pitcher with the authority of someone who had given rooms to all kinds of trouble and intended to be neutral about this particular variety. "Lewis Barlow is a decent man. That is my only comment on the matter." Minnie ate her supper alone at a corner table and thought very hard about the trap she might have walked into and the hidden motives that might lie behind a forged deed. Because she was beginning to understand the shape of it, if her deed was legitimate, then Lewis Barlow's claim was false. And if his deed was legitimate, then someone had forged hers. And the question of who had done which, and why, opened into a darkness she had not anticipated when she boarded the stage in Dodge City. She slept badly and woke before dawn, lying in the thin gray light listening to the horses in the livery 2 streets over, and the distant sound of cattle. A low perpetual murmur on the wind that she would come to understand was as constant as weather in this part of Texas. She thought about Clarence Redmond, who she had barely known. She thought about the lawyer, Aldous Hatch, whose letters had been so precise and so apparently earnest. She thought about the $40 for travel expenses, which suggested forethought, affection, genuine intent. She was down at the land office when Percy Gill unlocked it at 8 o'clock, and she spent 2 hours with the record books, which Percy Gill left her to examine with the resigned expression of a man who had decided that cooperation was the path of least resistance. What she found was disturbing. Her deed was dated February 14, 1882, 2 days after Clarence Redmond's recorded death. It was registered with the county on March 3rd, which aligned with the date of Aldous Hatch's first letter to her. Lewis Barlow's deed was dated November 7, 1879, and was registered in the county records on November 12th of that same year. His claim predated her uncle's death by more than 2 years. But there was a problem with that, and she saw it the moment she looked at the original survey records. The Redmond parcel had been filed under Clarence Redmond's name in 1871, when the land was first surveyed under the Texas General Land Office's post-war resettlement program. He had held it, according to the tax records, continuously from that date. The property taxes had been paid every year through 1881. The 1882 taxes were unpaid, but that was easily explained. Clarence had died in February, and she had not yet arrived to manage the estate. So how could Lewis Barlow have purchased land in 1879 that was already legally registered to another man? She sat back in Percy Gill's office chair and looked at the ceiling and felt the cold, clarifying touch of betrayal move through her chest. Not betrayal by Lewis Barlow specifically, not yet, but betrayal by someone. Somewhere in the chain of documents, someone had been dishonest, and the question of who and to what purpose was one she intended to answer. She asked Percy Gill if she could speak with the county assessor. "That be Raymond Colt," Percy Gill said, unhappily. "He's also the deputy sheriff." Minnie thanked him and went to find Raymond Colt. She found him instead in the person of Lewis Barlow, who was leaning against the post outside the assessor's office with his arms folded and his hat pulled low against the morning glare, as if he had been waiting for her. "You've been looking at the records," he said. "How would you know that?" "Because Percy Gill came and found me at the feed store 20 minutes ago and told me you were doing exactly that." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. "Percy doesn't much enjoy being in the middle of things." "Neither do I," Minnie said, "but here we both are." He straightened up from the post and looked at her in that careful, assessing way she was beginning to recognize as simply how he observed the world, not coldly, but precisely, taking inventory of what was actually in front of him rather than what he expected. "What did you find?" "Your deed predates my uncle's death by 2 years, she said. "His deed predates yours by 8. Would you like to tell me how you came to purchase land that was already registered to another man?" Something moved behind his eyes. Not guilt, she thought, something more complicated than guilt. "Come inside," he said. "This isn't a conversation for a street." She followed him into the assessor's office, which was empty. Raymond Colt was apparently out making his rounds, and Lewis Barlow closed the door behind them and pulled 2 chairs away from the wall and set them facing each other without sitting down, as if establishing the architecture of a conversation he had clearly been planning. "In November of 1879, he said, "I went to the land office in Amarillo to register a purchase. I had bought the parcel from a man named Doyle Fitch, who told me he had acquired it from the previous owner through a private sale. I paid Doyle Fitch $900. I have the bill of sale." "And what did you do with it?" Minnie asked. "I registered it, built a house, ran cattle on it for 3 years. He paused. "I had no reason to believe there was any dispute. The land was unoccupied. No one came to object. I assumed the previous owner had simply sold up and moved on. It happens all the time out here." "My uncle never sold that land," Minnie said flatly. "He paid taxes on it through 1881. Lewis Barlow sat down then, slowly, and put his elbows on his knees and looked at the floor for a moment with an expression that told her he was not surprised by this. Not entirely, and that was interesting. "I know," he said quietly. The word dropped into the room like a stone into still water, and Minnie felt the silence expand around it. "You know," she repeated. "I have been asking questions about Doyle Fitch for the last 6 months, he said, raising his eyes to her face. "I have reason to believe that Doyle Fitch is not the man he presented himself as. I have reason to believe I was defrauded, but I could never prove it because Doyle Fitch left this county about 18 months ago, and I have not been able to find him since." Minnie looked at him for a long, careful moment. The morning light came through the narrow window of the assessor's office and laid a stripe of gold across the floorboards between them. Outside she could hear the town beginning its daily business, horses and voices and the clatter of commerce, all the ordinary sounds of a place that was going about its life entirely unaware of the question sitting in this small room. "So you believe your own deed is fraudulent," she said. "I believe Doyle Fitch sold me something he had no right to sell," Lewis Barlow said. "Yes." "Then why were you standing in that land office yesterday with the expression of a man who intended to fight me for it?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that surprised her. "Because this is my home. I have lived there for 3 years. I built every fence post. I dug the second well. I have 200 head of cattle that depend on those water rights." He looked at her steadily. "That does not make me right, but it is why my expression looked the way it did." Minnie sat back in her chair and let that settle into her understanding of the situation. She had come here expecting a villain. She had expected a land grabber, a claim jumper, the kind of man the newspapers back east wrote about in sensational terms when they described the dark underbelly of Western settlement. She had not expected a man who freely admitted he might have been deceived, sitting in a small office with the afternoon sun on the floor between them, looking at her not with defiance but with an honesty that made the whole situation considerably more difficult. "We need to find Doyle Fitch," she said. Something in Lewis Barlow's face shifted. "Miss Redmond, if I could find Doyle Fitch, I would have found him a year ago." "I'm sure you've been looking," she said. "But you've been looking as a man who wants to know if he was cheated. I'll be looking as a woman whose inheritance depends on proving that he was. The motivation is somewhat different." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're not at all what I expected," he said. "You expected someone who would be frightened off," she said. "I expected someone who would take one look at a county in dispute and go back to wherever they came from," he admitted, with a directness she found unexpectedly refreshing. "I came from a rented room in St. Louis," Minnie said. "There is nothing to go back to." That landed differently than she intended, and she saw it in his face, a subtle recalibration, as if he were seeing the full dimensions of the situation for the first time. Not a woman with a speculative claim, a woman with no alternative. "All right," he said. "Then I suggest we do this together." "You suggest we cooperate," she said slowly, testing the shape of it. "I suggest that we both want the same thing, which is the truth about that parcel, and that we will find it faster working together than spending the next 6 months in court documents and county filings." He met her eyes. "And I suggest that the longer this is unresolved, the more it costs both of us." She thought about that for a moment. She thought about the hidden motives that could lurk beneath such an offer. She thought about the possibility that this was a trap of some sophisticated design, that he was charming her into cooperation, so that she would lower her guard and find herself outmaneuvered. But she also thought about the way he had said what he said, without calculation, without the smooth delivery of a man working an angle. He had the quality of a person who had learned the hard way that honesty was less expensive than its alternatives. "Where do we start?" she asked. "With the man who sold Doyle Fitch the deed in the first place," Lewis Barlow said, "which is a conversation I have been trying to have for a very long time." The man he was referring to was named Silas Crow, and he was the former land registrar of Harlan County, the man who had held Percy Gill's position before Percy Gill, and who had retired abruptly in early 1880 under circumstances that were described in polite company as ill health, and in less polite company as something else entirely. Silas Crow lived 4 miles east of town in a house that had once been a stage stop before the route was redirected, and he had not been into Harlan proper in over 2 years. Lewis Barlow knew where he lived because Lewis Barlow knew where everyone in the county lived, which was simply the nature of being someone who had built a life in a small place. He had tried to visit Crow twice before and been turned away at the gate by an old man with a shotgun who claimed that Mr. Crow was not receiving visitors. They rode out to the Crow place on the morning after their conversation in the assessor's office. Lewis Barlow lent Minnie a horse from his own string, a steady bay mare named Duchess, who required almost no management and seemed mildly amused by the novelty of a new rider. Minnie had grown up riding horses for the brief years of her childhood when such things were available to her, and she found the rhythm of it returned quickly, like a language spoken in the body rather than the mind. The country between town and the Crow place was beautiful in the way of land that has not been tamed, grass stretching in long waves in the morning wind, the sky an enormous vault of blue above them with a single line of high white cloud along the western horizon. There were hawks. There was the smell of warm grass and dry earth and somewhere cattle. Everything was large. Minnie, who had spent 7 years in the compressed geography of a city, felt herself expanding slightly, like a lung drawing its first full breath. Lewis Barlow rode beside her without conversation for a while, which she appreciated. He did not seem to feel the need to fill silence with performance. He sat his horse the way very experienced riders do, as though the horse were simply an extension of his own movement, his hat brim cutting a clean line against the sky. "How long have you had your ranch?" she asked after a while. 3 years here," he said. "Before that I worked for a man named Alderton up in the Panhandle for 4 years. I saved everything I earned for those 4 years. $900 was about what I had." "You put everything into it," she said. "Everything," he confirmed without particular drama, just a fact. She understood then in a way she had understood before only in the abstract what her claim meant to him, not just land. The entire architecture of the life he had built with the work of years, the fences he had mentioned, the well he had dug, the 200 head of cattle that represented every financial decision he had made since he was old enough to make financial decisions. And yet he was riding beside her toward the man who might be able to prove that he had no right to any of it. "You could have made this very difficult for me," she said carefully. "You could have buried me in county filings and made it expensive and slow. You could have hoped I'd run out of money before you ran out of patience." "I could have," he agreed. "Why didn't you?" He looked at her briefly, then back at the horizon. "Because I was raised to believe that a person either knows what they owe and pays it or spends their life pretending they don't. And I don't want to be the second kind of person." She thought about that for the rest of the ride. Sela's Crow's property was ringed by a post fence that had once been white and was now the gray of weathered wood, the boards pulling loose in several places. The house itself was solidly built but neglected, the porch stacked with old crates and a disassembled harness, and several items that might once have served a purpose and had long since lost it. An old man sat in a chair on the porch with a shotgun across his knees, and Minnie recognized this as the obstacle Lewis Barlow had described. "That's Chester," Lewis Barlow said quietly as they pulled up at the gate. "He's been with Crow for 30 years, loyal as a dog and twice as territorial." He dismounted and tied his horse to the gatepost and helped Minnie down without asking, just a brief steadying hand that was gone before she could decide how she felt about it, and then he walked up to the fence and stood there with his hat in his hand. "Chester," he said, "I need to speak with Mr. Crow. This is important." "Mr. Crow ain't well," Chester said, in the flat voice of a man who has said the same thing many times. "Chester," Lewis Barlow said, "this woman is Minnie Redmond. She is the niece of Clarence Redmond, who owned this parcel before Doyle Fitch got hold of it. She has a deed. She has come from Missouri to take possession. And what that means is that somebody in this county committed fraud, and if we cannot sort it out quietly between ourselves, the county sheriff is going to have to sort it out for us, and I do not think Mr. Crow would enjoy that conversation." Chester looked at Minnie. Then he looked at Lewis Barlow. Then he looked at the shotgun in his lap with the expression of a man calculating odds. "5 minutes," he said. Silas Crow was in his 70s, thinner than his bones could comfortably afford, sitting in a dim parlor with a glass of something amber on the side table and a quilt across his legs regardless of the summer heat. He had the face of a man who had been afraid for a long time and had grown used to it, the way chronic pain becomes a kind of background music you stop noticing only when it stops. He looked at Lewis Barlow with wariness. He looked at Minnie Redmond with something that was not quite guilt, but was close enough to it to make the room feel smaller. "You know why we're here," Lewis Barlow said. "Not a question." "I had nothing to do with the forgery," Crow said immediately, which told them both without ambiguity that he knew about the forgery. "Then who did?" Minnie asked. The story came out slowly, with the reluctance of a thing that has been compressed under weight for a long time and does not expand easily when the pressure is released. Doyle Fitch, it turned out, was the nephew of a county judge named Perrin Fitch, who had served in Harlan County from 1876 to 1880, and whose influence had been considerable, and whose ethics had been flexible. When Clarence Redmond fell seriously ill in the winter of 1878, and it became apparent that he might not recover, he did recover, but only partially, and his recovery had been nobody's business but his own. Judge Perrin Fitch had seen an opportunity. Clarence Redmond had no will at the time. He had no documented heirs in the county. The land was productive and the water rights were valuable. What happened next, Crow explained with the careful precision of a man who had been waiting for years for someone to ask him the right questions, was that Judge Fitch had instructed him, in his capacity as land registrar, to prepare a duplicate deed to the Redmond parcel in the name of a fictional prior claimant, which would then be used as the basis for a private sale to Doyle Fitch. "He told me it was a legal recovery of an abandoned claim," Crow said. "He told me Redmond had abandoned it. He showed me papers." He stopped. "I knew the papers weren't right. I let myself believe they were. And when you got uncomfortable," Lewis Barlow said, "you retired." "I couldn't prove anything," Crow said, "and Perrin Fitch was a judge." "Where is Judge Fitch now?" Minnie asked. "Dead," Crow said. "Heart failure, February of last year." "And Doyle Fitch?" Crow was quiet for a moment. "Last I heard, Doyle was in Tascosa." Lewis Barlow looked at Minnie. Tascosa was a rough trading town on the Canadian River about 60 miles northwest. It was not a place that invited casual visits, but it was not inaccessible. "Will you put what you just told us in writing?" Minnie asked Crow. Silas Crow looked at his amber glass. He looked at his quilt. He looked at the window where the morning light was coming in through the dust on the panes. "I'm an old man," he said. "You're an old man who has been living with a secret that belongs to two people sitting in this room," Minnie said, not unkindly, "and I think you've been waiting to put it down." Crow looked at her for a long, searching moment. Then he nodded. They spent another hour in the dim parlor while Silas Crow wrote 3 pages of statement in a surprisingly firm hand, describing in detail the events of 1878 and 1879. The involvement of Judge Perrin Fitch, and the creation of the fraudulent deed that had subsequently been sold to Lewis Barlow. He signed it and Chester witnessed it, and Chester turned out to have a notarial seal from his days as a justice of the peace in another county, which Crow appeared to have known about, and Chester appeared to have been saving for exactly this sort of occasion. They rode back toward town with the statement in Lewis Barlow's inside coat pocket, and the day had warmed considerably, the sky deepening toward noon blue, the grass flattened by a steady south wind. "You'll take this to the county attorney," Lewis Barlow said. "We'll take this to the county attorney," Minnie said. "We both need resolution." He glanced at her. "You're right," he said. "We." There was something different in that word, the way he said it, that she noticed and immediately decided not to think about too carefully. The county attorney was a young man named Augustus Webb who had come to Harlan 2 years before from a legal practice in San Antonio, ambitious and sharp and somewhat contemptuous of the informal justice that had characterized the county under Judge Fitch's tenure. He read Crow's statement with a growing attention that turned his face very still and very focused, and when he was done, he set it down on his desk and looked at both of them. "This is sufficient to open a formal inquiry," he said. "I'll need to depose Crow formally, and I'll need to verify the record alterations in the county books." He paused. "You understand this will take time." "How long?" Minnie asked. "Weeks, possibly months, before formal title is adjudicated," Webb said. "These things move at the pace of law, not urgency." Lewis Barlow leaned forward slightly in his chair. "In the meantime, what's the status of the property?" "In the meantime," Webb said carefully, "I would recommend that both claimants maintain the status quo. Which is to say, Mr. Barlow continues operations on the property and Miss Redmond," he paused, "does not take possession pending resolution." "Miss Redmond," Minnie said, "has no other residence." The silence that followed was the particular quiet of a situation that had just become more complicated than anyone in the room had prepared for. Lewis Barlow stood up from his chair and went to the window and looked out at the street. He stood there for a moment with his back to them, and Minnie watched the set of his shoulders and tried to read what was happening in the stillness of his posture. "The ranch house has a spare room," he said, to the window. "It's clean. There's a lock on the door." He turned around. "If Miss Redmond needs a place to stay while this is resolved, she is welcome to stay at the ranch. It is, after all, arguably as much hers as mine." The audacity of the offer, the logical precision of it, and the absolute insanity of it from the perspective of propriety all arrived in Minnie's mind simultaneously. "That is an unusual suggestion," Augustus Webb said, with the careful tone of a man choosing between the professional and the personal. "It's a practical one," Lewis Barlow said. Minnie looked at him across the small office. He was looking at her with that direct, serious attention that she was beginning to understand was simply how he looked at anything he considered important. No performance in it, no calculation, just the honest engagement of a person who had decided that straightforwardness was worth its social costs. "The hotel is $3 a week," she said. "The spare room is free," he said. She thought about the $40 and what remained of it after 12 days of travel. She thought about weeks, possibly months. She thought about the impracticality of maintaining a hotel room on a seamstress's savings, while waiting for a legal process to resolve itself. "I will accept on the condition that the arrangement is clearly understood by everyone in this town to be a practical matter," she said, "not a social one." "I'll spread the word myself," Lewis Barlow said, and the corner of his mouth did that thing again, the not quite smile, and she decided firmly that she was not going to find that endearing. She moved her trunk out of the Harlan Hotel the following morning. Mrs. Pryor accepted her departure with a nod and a look that communicated both understanding and a careful withholding of opinion. The ride out to the Barlow Ranch took 20 minutes through the same open country she had ridden the day before, except that this time Lewis Barlow had a buckboard for her trunk, and she sat beside him on the seat, and the morning was very blue, and the cattle were lowing in the distance like a continuous low note held by the land itself. The ranch house was a surprise. She had expected the rough, functional dwelling of a man living alone by necessity, and what she found instead was a structure that had been built with clear-intentioned solid stone foundation, a wide front porch with proper posts, 3 rooms inside that were simple but arranged with care, the kitchen equipped with a good cast-iron stove and a proper pantry shelf, the parlor with 2 chairs and a small bookshelf that held perhaps 20 volumes, the spare room with its promised lock and a window that faced east over the pasture. "You built this yourself?" she asked. "With some help," he said. "Couple of men from town. 3 weeks in the summer of 1880. She looked at the bookshelf. The volumes were practical: a stock management manual, an almanac, a Bible that looked genuinely read, a medical reference, but also Dickens, a complete volume of Shakespeare's works that had clearly been read many times to judge by its spine, and a collection of poems by someone named Bret Harte whose work she did not know. "You read," she said, and realized immediately how that sounded. "Every chance I get," he said without offense. "Winter's long out here." She turned from the bookshelf and found him watching her with that steady attention, and for the first time she felt something that was not quite discomfort, or rather, it was a kind of discomfort that came not from threat but from proximity, from being in a small room with a large man who was looking at you with absolute honesty and making no particular secret of the fact that he found you interesting. "I'll try not to be in your way," she said. "You won't be," he said simply. She wasn't. Or rather, they were both in each other's way continuously, in the inevitable manner of two people sharing a domestic space, but it had none of the friction she had feared. He rose at 5 in the morning and was out with the cattle before she woke, leaving the kitchen warm from the stove he had already built up, and she fell into the habit of making breakfast for both of them, which he accepted with a gratitude that was quiet and genuine. They ate together in the kitchen in the early mornings when he came back in from checking the stock, and she discovered that he was a person who talked well when there was something worth saying, and was entirely comfortable with silence when there wasn't, which matched her own conversational temperament so closely that she found herself disoriented by the ease of it. He told her about the cattle, the specific concerns of a small ranching operation in 1882, the water hole management, the fencing disputes that had nothing to do with their own dispute, and everything to do with the larger tensions between the open range tradition and the incoming nesters who were filing homestead claims and running wire. He told her about the problems with the previous summer's grass, which had been thinner than usual after a dry spring. He told her about the arrangement he had with a cattle broker in Amarillo who took his beef to the railhead. She told him about St. Louis, about the dress shop and the precision of the work, about the women who came in for alterations who carried their small dramas and large secrets with equal invisibility, about the loneliness of the city, which was a different kind of loneliness than she imagined the plains produced, crowded and anonymous, a loneliness of being surrounded by people who would never know your name. "You stayed 7 years," he said, one morning when they were talking about this, his coffee mug held between both hands. "I didn't know where else to go," she said, "until your land gave me a reason." He looked at her over the mug. "My land," he said, with a faint emphasis on the word that was not combative but acknowledging. The question was still open, and they both knew it, but they were living around it rather than in it. "The land in question," she corrected, with a slight smile. He smiled back then fully for the first time, and she discovered that Lewis Barlow smiling was a different experience than Lewis Barlow not smiling, in a way she was going to have to spend some time not thinking about. 3 weeks passed in this manner, and in those 3 weeks a number of things happened that altered the shape of her understanding of where she was and who she was among. The ranch hand, a young man named Pete Driscoll who was 19 and earnest and had apparently worked for Lewis for 2 years, accepted her presence with the uncomplicated approval of a person who found the addition of competent help in any form simply logical. She began helping with small tasks, mending harness leather, which was not dissimilar to the sewing she knew, keeping the kitchen organized so that the meals that came out of it were better than the mostly self-sufficient but somewhat haphazard cooking Lewis Barlow had been producing alone. She learned to read the weather in the sky above the plains, which was a different language from city weather, wilder and more honest. She also rode the land. Lewis Barlow offered her the bay mare without conditions, and she began taking morning rides along the Cimarron Fork, learning the terrain of the 700 acres that bore her name. She rode the fence lines and the creek banks and the long west slope where the grass grew particularly thick, and the cattle gathered in the afternoons. She sat on a slight rise one morning and looked at all of it, the way it spread out under the enormous sky, and felt something move in her chest that was not merely acquisitiveness, not merely the practical recognition of property. It was something older and more personal than that. This land had been her uncle's. He had stood on this ground and watched the same sky and heard the same wind. She had barely known him, but he had known about her, had remembered her specifically, had left this to her specifically. That meant something. She was not sure yet what it meant, but it was not nothing. She was on the west slope one afternoon, 3 weeks into her stay, when Lewis Barlow rode up and stopped his horse beside hers without speaking, and they both looked at the land together for a while. "My uncle loved this place," she said. "I can understand that," Lewis Barlow said quietly. She looked at him. He was looking at the distance, at the long sweep of grass and sky, with an expression she recognized because she had felt it herself, the love of a particular piece of ground. The specific attachment that forms not because a place is extraordinary but because it is yours. "What will you do?" she asked. "If the adjudication goes against you?" He was quiet for a long time. "I don't know," he said finally. "I have some money saved. Not much. I'd lose the 3 years I've put into the stock improvements and the infrastructure." He paused. "I'd start again, I suppose. There's land in New Mexico that's opening up." "You'd lose your home," she said. "Yes." She thought about that, and about what it would mean to take it from him, and about the fact that she could not quite make herself feel triumphant about that possibility. She had come here with the clear and certain conviction of someone claiming what was rightfully theirs, and that conviction had not exactly dissolved, but it had become considerably more complicated than she had anticipated when she was standing in the land office with her crumpled deed. What was becoming increasingly clear to her was that there were 2 victims of Doyle Fitch and Judge Perrin Fitch's deception, herself, who had been kept from her inheritance for 3 years, and Lewis Barlow, who had paid $900 for something he had no legal right to own without knowing it, and had poured 3 years of his life into it besides. And only one of them could win the adjudication. Unless. The thought arrived in stages over the following days, assembled itself piece by piece from the conversations they had at the kitchen table and on horseback, and in the evenings when the day's work was done and they sat on the porch in the cooling dark while Pete Driscoll played a mouth organ somewhere in the bunkhouse. The thought was essentially this: the land was large enough and the water rights extensive enough to support 2 operations, a joint claim, a partnership. Something that preserved the 3 years Lewis had invested while also honoring the legal inheritance she held. It was a practical idea. She told herself it was entirely practical. She was less successful at telling herself that the reason she was thinking about it had nothing to do with the way he had handed her the coffee that morning, his fingers briefly adjacent to hers on the handle, or the way he had looked at her that evening when she had read aloud from the Dickens on the shelf, and he had sat across from her in the lamplight with the particular stillness of someone listening with their whole attention. She was 24 years old, and she had been largely alone for 7 years, and she was a careful person by training and inclination. She did not want to confuse gratitude with something more significant. She did not want to confuse proximity with affinity. She did not want to make the mistake of attaching her practical future to the romantic idea of a man she had known for less than a month, however much that man had refused to be what she expected and had instead been entirely something else. She told herself all of this very firmly, and then Doyle Fitch arrived in town. He had not come voluntarily. Augustus Webb, the county attorney, had sent a legal summons to Tascosa through the sheriff's office there, and Doyle Fitch had apparently calculated that ignoring a summons in a fraud case was likely to result in worse consequences than complying with it. And so, he had arrived in Harlan on a Wednesday morning in September on the back of a horse that looked as exhausted as its rider. Minnie heard about it from Pete Driscoll, who had been in town for supplies and came back with the news, and she and Lewis Barlow rode into town together, arriving at the county attorney's office to find a man in his 40s, heavyset and restless-eyed, sitting in a chair across from Augustus Webb with the specific posture of a man who has been in legal trouble before and has various strategies for navigating it. Doyle Fitch looked at Lewis Barlow with the wary recognition of someone seeing a reckoning they have been half expecting for some time. He looked at Minnie with something that was briefly, involuntarily, guilt. The deposition took the better part of the morning. Webb conducted it with the systematic patience of a man who had prepared thoroughly, and Fitch, confronted with Crow's written statement and the county record evidence and the patience of a lawyer who clearly intended to be in this room as long as necessary, told the truth. Not all of it willingly, and not all at once, but by noon they had a complete picture. Judge Perrin Fitch had orchestrated the scheme. Doyle Fitch had executed it, handling the sale to Lewis Barlow and the payment to Silas Crow to alter the records. The original fraudulent deed had been manufactured from a template Crow provided and forged with the judge's seal. Doyle Fitch had received $600 of the $900 Lewis paid, the remaining $300 going to Crow. He had heard about Clarence Redmond's death and had apparently considered the scheme closed, not anticipating that Redmond had a niece in St. Louis with a lawyer and a legitimate deed. After the deposition, Webb presented Doyle Fitch with the choice of a formal criminal complaint for fraud or full cooperation with the adjudication process and restitution to Lewis Barlow of the $900 paid. Given that Judge Perrin Fitch was dead, and the man most responsible for the scheme was therefore unavailable for prosecution, and given that Doyle Fitch's complete cooperation would serve the interests of justice more efficiently than a lengthy trial, Webb recommended the restitution path. Doyle Fitch, after some negotiation conducted through a lawyer he sent from the hotel, agreed. The $900 were to be paid over 6 months. The fraudulent deed was formally declared void, and the Redmond parcel reverted to its legal owner, Minnie Redmond. They rode back out to the ranch in the late afternoon, the sky going gold and red over the western grass, the cattle moving slowly toward the creek in the evening light. She was aware, with a clarity that had been building for weeks and had today become unavoidable, of what this resolution meant. The legal question was answered. The practical question, what happened next, was now the only question remaining. She looked over at Lewis Barlow, riding beside her. His face was quiet in the late light, unreadable in the way he became when he was thinking about something he had not yet decided how to address. "What will you do?" she asked. The same question she had asked him on the hillside, but different now because the answer had different stakes. "Tonight, probably eat supper and try to sleep," he said. "Lewis." He looked at her at the sound of his name. She had been careful, she realized, to use it rarely, and the rarity gave it weight. "I know what I should do," he said quietly. "I should start planning to move operations to New Mexico. Is that what you want to do?" He looked at her for a long moment, the golden light of the late afternoon making the pale gray of his eyes seem warmer, and she felt the stakes of the next words sharper than she had felt anything since she walked into the land office with her deed in her fist. "No," he said, "it is not what I want to do." She took a breath. "I've been thinking," she said, "about a different possibility." He waited. "The land is large enough for a partnership," she said. 700 acres, good water rights. One house, admittedly, though a house can be expanded." She paused. "I don't know how to run a cattle ranch. I know how to manage a property, and I know how to learn, and I know how to work. But I do not know cattle." "I do," Lewis Barlow said. "Yes," Minnie said. "You do." The sun was lowering toward the horizon, and the grass was golden all around them, and the cattle were lowing in the evening quiet, and Lewis Barlow pulled his horse to a stop, which meant she stopped too, and they sat there in the middle of the parcel that was hers by law and his by love, and looked at each other with the full weight of a month of honesty between them. "A partnership," he said. "Of whatever kind made sense," she said, and was immediately embarrassed by how much that revealed, because there were several kinds of partnership, and her voice had not been neutral about which ones she was considering. "I'm going to ask you a very direct question," Lewis Barlow said, "because I have found that it is the most efficient way I know to determine where a conversation is actually going." "All right," Minnie said. "When you say a partnership of whatever kind made sense," he said slowly, "are you speaking about a legal arrangement concerning 700 acres of Texas grassland, or are you speaking about something that would also involve, eventually, the expansion of the house you mentioned?" Her heart was hammering in a way she had not felt since she was 17 years old, and everything was urgent and new. And she was 24, and she had crossed 4 states alone and stood down a cattle rancher in a land office on the strength of a crumpled deed, and she was not going to be frightened of an honest question. "Both," she said. Lewis Barlow looked at her for a long, still moment. Then he dismounted from his horse in one smooth movement, and he came around to her side and held up a hand, and she took it and stepped down, and when she was on the ground, he did not let go of her hand. "I have been trying," he said very quietly, "for the past 3 weeks, to maintain an appropriate professional distance from a woman who is simultaneously my business adversary and the most interesting person I have encountered in 4 years of living in this county." "How has that been going?" she asked. "Badly," he said. She laughed. It came out of her like something that had been held under pressure, genuine and bright, and she felt the laughter move through him too, not loudly but deeply. And he raised his free hand and touched the side of her face with a gentleness that was entirely unexpected from a man who had the hands of someone who had spent years doing hard physical work. "I don't want to go to New Mexico," he said. "I don't want you to go to New Mexico," she said. He kissed her then, in the golden September light with the grass bending in the evening wind and the cattle moving along the creek, a kiss that was careful and certain at the same time, the way Lewis Barlow did most things, with full attention and complete honesty and no performance whatsoever. She kissed him back with the same quality, and when they stepped apart they were both breathing slightly differently, and the sunset had gone from gold to deep red, and the evening star had appeared in the east. "I think," Lewis Barlow said, "that we should ride back to the house and have supper and talk about this properly." "Yes," Minnie agreed. "I think that would be the sensible course." Neither of them moved for a moment. "In a minute," she added. "In a minute," he agreed. They were married on the 14th of October, 1882, in the small stone church on the east side of Harlan, on a day when the weather had turned and there was a cold bite in the air that smelled like the first edge of autumn. The town came, because the town was small and weddings were occasions regardless of how complicated the preceding circumstances had been, and Mrs. Pryor from the hotel brought a cake and allowed herself a small smile that communicated both approval and satisfaction at having correctly identified the trajectory of events. Pete Driscoll stood as witness with an expression of deep personal relief, because the uncertainty of the preceding months had been hard on a young man's nerves, and he had very much wanted to know whether he still had a job, which it appeared he did. Aldous Hatch, the lawyer from Harlan who had written the original letter to Minnie in St. Louis, attended and appeared briefly moved, having never entirely anticipated the full consequence of the letter he had written. He told Minnie privately that Clarence Redmond had spoken of her in his last weeks with genuine affection, that he had spent years trying to locate her through the mail before succeeding, and that he had died at peace with the knowledge that she would be found. Minnie received this information quietly, standing by the church window with the October sky very blue outside, and felt the long thread of connection between herself and the uncle she had barely known pull taut and resolve into something that felt, finally, like belonging. They spent their wedding night in the ranch house that was now unambiguously both of theirs, and they did not talk about the legal arrangements or the cattle or the water rights. And in the morning they sat at the kitchen table in the early light, and Lewis Barlow poured the coffee with an ease and happiness that made the whole room seem different from every morning that had preceded it. The first winter was the hardest and also the best. Hard because ranching in the Texas Panhandle in the winter of 1882 was genuinely demanding. A December cold snap that froze the water troughs and required breaking ice twice daily. A January storm that came down from the north with the particular ferocity of a plains blizzard, and kept them inside for 4 days, burning through wood and food, and the good quality of being confined to a warm place with a person you found endlessly interesting. Best because of exactly that, The 4 days of the storm, the lamplight and the Dickens read aloud, and the chess game Lewis had had to teach her because she had never learned, and the long, quiet evenings of the first weeks of a life being built together. She learned cattle. This was not a swift or graceful process, and it produced several incidents that Lewis Barlow found quietly, helplessly amusing, and that she found mortifying and then, with time, also funny. She had an aptitude for the bookkeeping side of the operation, which had been somewhat neglected under the Lewis alone regime, and she reorganized the ranch accounts with the same systematic precision she had applied to Mrs. Halloran's inventory at the dress shop in St. Louis, to Lewis's considerable satisfaction. He was a patient teacher, which she had expected from his general character, but also a demanding one, which she had not entirely anticipated. He expected thoroughness. He expected consistency. He expected that if she said she would do a thing, she would do it, even when the weather was difficult or the task was unpleasant, and she found that she not only met that expectation but was challenged by it in a way she had not been challenged in years, and that challenge felt like respect rather than pressure. In the spring of 1883, with the legal adjudication formally concluded, and the Redmond parcel's title cleared and registered in both their names as the Barlow Ranch, Minnie discovered she was expecting their first child. She told Lewis on a Sunday morning in April when the wildflowers were coming up along the creek bank, and the sky was the pure, uncomplicated blue of a perfect spring day. His reaction was a stillness of the particular kind she had come to recognize as extreme emotion managed by a person who experienced emotion deeply and expressed it carefully. He was quiet for about 30 seconds, which felt long, and then he looked at her with an expression she had not quite seen before on his face, something that was beyond the usual even directness of his gaze, something large and bright and entirely unguarded. He said her name. Just her name, Minnie. And then he kissed her, and she laughed into the kiss, and they stood in the doorway of the ranch house with the spring air coming in off the grass and the whole country golden around them, and it was the best morning of her life to that point. Their son was born in November of 1883, a healthy, loud, red-faced boy whom they named Clarence after her uncle and called Clay for short. Clay Barlow arrived in the world with the same emphatic conviction with which his mother had arrived at the Harlan County Land Office 14 months before, which Lewis said the first time he held him, studying the furious red face of his newborn son with the careful attention he gave to everything. "He's going to be difficult," Lewis said, with enormous fondness. "He's going to be determined," Minnie corrected. "Those are the same thing in this family," Lewis said. The years went by with the particular quality of years that are full, not easy, exactly, because nothing about ranching life in the Texas Panhandle in the 1880s was easy, but full in the sense of substance, of meaning, of the continuous accumulation of a life being built with intention and shared purpose. They expanded the cattle operation in 1884, when the restitution payments from Doyle Fitch were complete, and the $900 returned to Lewis was invested in 20 additional breeding cows that improved the quality of the herd considerably. They hired a second hand, a quiet, capable man in his 30s named Frank Mears, who had come up from New Mexico and settled in the county, and proved to be as reliable as Pete Driscoll, who had by this point been with them for 3 years and was becoming a genuinely skilled cattleman. In the summer of 1885, Minnie discovered she was expecting again, and in February of 1886 a daughter arrived, a girl with dark hair and her father's serious eyes and her mother's stubbornness, whom they named Ruth. Clay, who was 2 years old and deeply uncertain about the new arrival for approximately 1 week, subsequently appointed himself Ruth's primary guardian with a ferocity that Lewis said reminded him of someone he knew. The ranch grew. This was not a sudden or dramatic growth, but the steady, compounding kind that comes from good management and consistent effort, and the sort of attention to detail that Lewis Barlow had always brought to his work, and that Minnie brought to hers. They were known in the county for well-managed cattle and dependable agreements, which in a community built on handshake transactions was a form of capital as real as money. Lewis served 2 years on the county grazing committee and was asked to serve as a justice of the peace, which he declined on the grounds that he had enough to manage, but recommended Augustus Webb for the district judgeship that opened in 1887, which Webb received, and which created a lasting professional friendship between the Barlow Ranch and the Harlan County Courthouse. Minnie became, in these years, something she had not anticipated when she left St. Louis, a person of consequence in a place. Not consequence in the abstract social sense, but the real kind, the kind that means people come to you when things are difficult because you have demonstrated that you know how to think through difficulty. She found herself advising younger women who came to the county from back east, some of them alone as she had been alone, some of them trailing the uncertainty of half-formed plans and insufficient preparation. She told them what she wished she had been told, that the West was not a simpler version of the East, and that the skills that served you in one place did not automatically transfer to the other, but that the skill that served you everywhere was the willingness to be exactly where you were instead of somewhere more comfortable and theoretical. She told Lewis once, on one of those evenings on the porch that had become a fixture of their life together, that she thought the best thing the land had given her was not the land itself. "What was it?" he asked. "The reason to be here," she said. "The reason to come west. If I hadn't had the deed, I would have stayed in St. Louis another 7 years or another 20. I would have spent my life in a place I fit into adequately but never loved." She looked out at the dark country, the stars enormous above the flat grassland. "The deed brought me to the land office. The land office brought me to you." He was quiet for a moment. "A stolen deed," he said. "The fraud served one honest purpose entirely by accident," she said. "What's that?" "It put 2 people who needed to meet each other in a room together," she said. He took her hand, there in the dark. With the particular ease of a gesture that had been made so many times, it had become part of the architecture of their shared life. "Clarence Redmond must have been a character," he said. "He must have been," she agreed. "I wish I had known him." "You know what he left you," Lewis said. "That's a kind of knowing." She thought about that, about the uncle who had remembered her, who had found her address, who had set aside $40 for her journey before he knew he was dying, about the deed that had crossed 4 states in a lawyer's envelope and arrived on a cold March morning in a rented room in St. Louis and changed everything. "Yes," she said, "it is." In the late fall of 1887, something happened that Minnie had not anticipated, and that brought the past briefly back into the present. Silas Crow, the former land registrar, died peacefully at his home 4 miles east of town, aged 74. In his effects, Chester found a sealed letter addressed to Minnie Barlow at the Barlow Ranch, which Chester delivered personally on a gray November afternoon. The letter was from Crow, dated the previous spring. In it he wrote that he had followed news of the ranch's success with something he described, without comfort, as private satisfaction, and that he wanted her to know that the relief of having told the truth in that small, dim parlor in the summer of 1882 had been real and lasting. He wrote that he was aware that his cooperation did not compensate for the original wrong, but that he hoped it had contributed in some material way to its correction. He wrote that he thought she and Lewis Barlow had done well with the parcel, and that Clarence Redmond, whatever his other qualities, had chosen his heir wisely. Minnie read the letter twice and then gave it to Lewis to read, and then sat for a while in the kitchen while the November wind worked at the window frames and clay, 4 years old and tireless, played with a set of wooden blocks on the floor and roof, not yet 2, slept in the cradle Lewis had built in the corner. "People are complicated," she said finally. "Yes," Lewis said, handing back the letter. "He was a coward and then he wasn't," she said. "Not all the way, but enough." "Sometimes enough is what's available," Lewis said. She looked at him across the kitchen, this man she had married at the end of a legal dispute over a piece of land, this man who had admitted freely when he might have been wrong, and offered honestly what he could offer, and kissed her in the September light with the gold grass all around them. She thought about the word enough and decided it was wrong in their case. This had been more than enough. This had been everything. Spring of 1889 brought two significant events. The first was that Texas weather, which had been kind for several years, delivered a drought of the kind that made old ranchers speak in hushed, respectful tones. The spring rains failed entirely, and the creek level dropped through June and July to a point that required careful management of the water rights to maintain the herd. Lewis spent long days monitoring the water situation, moving cattle between the two sections of the parcel to distribute grazing pressure, hauling supplemental water in the summer heat. It was during this difficult summer that the arrangement of the Barlow Ranch water rights, the same rights that had made the parcel worth contesting in 1882, proved their value most clearly. Because the Redmond deed had included senior water rights on the Cimarron Fork dating to Clarence's original 1871 claim, the Barlow Ranch was able to maintain adequate supply through the drought, while several neighboring operations suffered serious losses. Lewis used this advantage not selfishly, but carefully, negotiating with two neighboring ranchers to share water access in exchange for grazing easements that improved the ranch's own grass management. It was the sort of deal that required trust, and trust required a reputation, and the Barlow Ranch's reputation in Harlan County in 1889 was solid as the stone foundation of the house itself. The second significant event of 1889 was that Minnie found herself expecting again. The third child arrived in January of 1890, another boy, dark like his father but with Minnie's eyes, whom they named James. Clay, 5 years old and firmly established as the senior sibling in terms of opinion, if not always wisdom, accepted James with the equanimity of someone who had already navigated Ruth's arrival and felt himself experienced in this regard. Ruth, 3 years old and already formidably certain of her own preferences, offered James a brief critical assessment and then accepted him on provisional terms. Lewis brought the baby in from where Minnie was resting and stood in the kitchen doorway holding James, while the older children ate their breakfast, and Minnie watched him from the doorway of the bedroom, leaning against the frame in the January morning light, watching the way he held the infant with the practiced confidence of a man who had learned this particular skill with full commitment, and she felt the full accumulated weight of 7 years of shared life move through her chest in a single quiet wave. He looked up and saw her watching. He did not say anything. He just looked at her with the steady, direct attention that she had first received with wariness and then with comprehension and had spent years understanding was the most complete form of regard she had ever been offered by anyone. She had been seen fully and honestly by this man, and she had seen him, and the seeing had been mutual and continuous and, she thought, entirely the foundation of everything else. She smiled at him. He smiled back. James, unimpressed with the emotional moment, made the emphatic sound of a person who has opinions about breakfast, and Clay slid off his chair immediately to come see, and Ruth followed, and the kitchen became the particular cheerful chaos of a household with 3 small children, and Lewis Barlow passed his newest son to his oldest child with careful instruction, and looked over Clay's head at his wife, and the smile on his face was everything. By 1892, when Harlan County was beginning to feel the changes that were coming to the west with the advancing railroad and the closing of the open range and all the disruptions of a frontier becoming a settled country, the Barlow Ranch was 250 acres larger than it had been in 1882. The herd was 340 head. There was a second outbuilding that served as a proper bunkhouse for 4 hands, and the house had been expanded twice. Once to add 2 additional bedrooms as the family grew, and once to add a proper parlor to the east side of the house, with a window that looked out over the creek and a shelf of books that had grown from Lewis's original 22. Considerably more than 100, many of them Minnie's contributions. The children grew with the ranch, which is to say they grew as part of a working operation, understanding from early ages that the land required care, and that care required attention and consistency. Clay was developing into a serious, competent young person with his mother's systematic thinking and his father's patience. Ruth had her mother's determination in full measure, and apparently intended to exercise it across the broadest possible range of human endeavor. James was quieter, more observational, with a gift for noticing things that others missed, which Lewis said quietly to Minnie one evening was the most useful quality a person could have. There was a summer evening in 1893 when they sat on the expanded front porch, all of them, Lewis and Minnie in the wooden chairs he had made in the winter, Clay nearly 10 and reading in the remaining light, Ruth 8 and engaged in some private project with a piece of rope that she had not explained, and that Minnie had decided not to question. James 7 and lying on the porch boards watching the first fireflies appear over the grass, and the evening was warm and quiet except for the cattle and the wind and the sound of Pete Driscoll's mouth organ, which he had never stopped playing, drifting from the bunkhouse. Minnie looked at Lewis. He was reading the almanac and making occasional small notations in the margin, which he had always done, and the lamplight was on his face, and there were lines at the corners of his eyes now that had not been there when she first saw him across the land office in the August heat of 1882, and his hair had a thread or two of gray in it that she had noticed arriving in the last year, and he was so completely, thoroughly himself. The same direct and honest person she had sat across from in the assessor's office, with the morning light coming in through the narrow window, that the continuity of it moved through her like a cord resolved. She thought about the deed, still kept in the document box in the bedroom with the water rights papers and the marriage certificate and the children's birth records. The crumpled deed she had slammed on the counter of the land office with her heart hammering, and her conviction fierce, and her absolute certainty that she was right, which she had been, and her equally absolute certainty that the man watching her from across the room was simply an obstacle, which she had been entirely, spectacularly wrong about. He had been the most important person she would ever meet. He had been the cattleman who made her question the claim, not in the sense of doubting her right, but in the sense of questioning what she was claiming for and what she meant to do with it and who she might become in the doing of it. He had made her ask herself questions she had not known to ask. What is a home? Not a deed, she knew now. Not a legal document, however hard one. A home was built by the same slow accumulation as trust, decision by decision, morning by morning, the coffee and the porch and the children, and the cattle and the long evenings with books, and the short words of a man who used language honestly, and therefore used it sparingly. She had come west to claim a piece of land. She had found something she could not have anticipated and could not now imagine living without. "Lewis," she said. He looked up from the almanac. "I'm glad I came to the land office that day," she said. He looked at her for a moment in the lamplight, and the evening was around them and the children were close and the grass was murmuring in the wind, and Lewis Barlow, who used words honestly and therefore never used them without meaning them, said, "So am I every day." Ruth, who was 8 years old and had the radar of a child for adult emotional moments, looked up from her rope project and said, "Are you going to be like this all evening?" Clay did not look up from his book. "They're always like this," he said. James, from the porch boards, smiled at the fireflies. And the evening settled over the Barlow ranch like a good blanket, warm and steady and entirely whole, the cattle lowing in the dark, the stars enormous over the Texas grassland, the lamplight in the window of the house that had been built by one man's hands and filled by two people's lives, and everything that had been broken by deception and restored by honesty was now simply the deep-rooted truth of the place they had made together. Solid and permanent and green, as the good grass that grew from the Texas earth to the edge of the enormous sky. In the years that followed, The Barlow Ranch became one of the fixtures of Harlan County in the way that lasting things do, not through drama or spectacle, but through the steady accumulation of reliability, of deals kept and neighbors helped, and hard seasons weathered with competence and grace. Lewis Barlow served eventually on the county commission, which he had always resisted, and only agreed to when it became clear that the alternative was someone whose approach to land management was considerably less equitable. He served 2 terms and was genuinely glad to return full-time to the cattle. Minnie Barlow was not a woman who sought formal recognition, but received informal recognition of the substantial kind. The kind where younger women found reasons to visit, and older women included her in the conversations that actually determined how things went in a community. She taught informal reading classes for several winters at the church hall, for adults as well as children, because she had discovered in her years of living in Harlan that literacy was unevenly distributed, and the inequality was neither natural nor necessary. Lewis helped build the shelves for the small lending library she eventually organized in the church hall, which became, in time, a proper library in the town's new stone building, with a dedication plaque that she considered entirely excessive, but was overruled on by her husband and all 3 of her children and the entire library committee. Clay Barlow married a rancher's daughter named Sarah Whitfield in 1902, when he was 18 years old and she was the same, and they settled 2 counties to the south on land that Clay had spent 4 years saving for, and the wedding was in October, and Lewis and Minnie danced at it with the ease of people who had danced together for 20 years. Ruth Barlow, who had never met an ambition she found fully satisfying, went east to study in 1903 at the age of 18, which caused her father a private moment of something he described as considerable mixed feeling, and her mother a private moment of something she described as complete pride, and which Minnie explained to Lewis late one evening was the difference between a man who had built his life by staying in a place and a woman who had built hers by leaving one. "You left," he said. "I left to come here," she said. "Ruth is leaving to find out where here is for her." He thought about that. "All right," he said. Ruth came back eventually. Not to the ranch, but to the county. She trained as a nurse and established a practice in Harlan Town in 1908, and the county was considerably better for her presence, and she married a quiet, book-reading doctor named Harris Webb, who was the nephew of Augustus Webb the judge, which Minnie found richly amusing and Lewis found entirely satisfying in a way he said had nothing to do with sentimentality. James Barlow, the observer, became a surveyor. This was almost certainly not a coincidence. He spent his working life measuring and recording the exact truth of what was actually there, which Minnie told Lewis was perhaps the most Barlow family occupation possible. James married a Mexican-American woman named Catalina Reyes, whose family had been in the Panhandle territory since long before the Americans arrived, and the wedding combined traditions in a way that produced the most enjoyable 2-day celebration Harlan County had seen in years. James and Catalina had 4 children and were extremely happy and lived in Amarillo, where the surveying work was most concentrated. Lewis Barlow and Minnie Redmond Barlow grew older in the house by the Cimarron Fork with the great sky above them and the good grass around them, and the cattle that were now managed largely by their son Clay and 2 of the long-term hands, because Lewis's knees had begun to object to certain elements of ranch work in a way that he dealt with by adapting rather than complaining. They sat on the porch on summer evenings and watched the same sky they had watched for 30 years, and it was never quite the same sky twice, which was one of the things she had come to understand about the plains. The sameness was superficial and the variation was infinite, which was also, she had found, a reasonably accurate description of a long and honest marriage. She still had the deed. The crumpled deed that she had held in her fist on the stage from Dodge City, that she had slammed on the counter of the land office in the August heat of 1882. It lived in the document box with the water rights papers and the marriage certificate and the birth records, and now, a small collection of items she had kept for reasons that were not legal but personal. A letter from Clay from the year he was 10, written for a school assignment about something he admired, in which he had written about watching his father dig a fence post in the summer heat, and understanding that caring for a thing was a form of love. A pressed flower from the creek bank from the spring of their first year. A note Lewis had left her one winter morning, very short, just her name, and "I am very glad you came," which she had found on the kitchen table when she came down to make the coffee. On a September morning in 1912, 30 years almost to the month from the morning she had ridden with Lewis Barlow toward Selah's Crow's property and begun to understand the shape of things, Minnie sat on the front porch in the early light and drank her coffee and watched the grass move in the dawn wind and thought about the journey from St. Louis and what she had known then and what she knew now. She had known that she had a legal right. She had known that rights required defending. She had known that she was alone and that aloneness was expensive in all kinds of ways. She had not known that the defense of a right could lead you into the company of a person whose integrity matched your own. She had not known that the questioning of a claim could be a kind of growth rather than a kind of defeat. She had not known that the land she came to claim would give her not just ground to stand on, but a life rooted deeply enough in that ground to outlast the disputes, and the seasons, and the difficulties, and the long, ordinary days of years. She heard the front door open behind her and Lewis came out with his own coffee and sat in the chair beside her, and they looked at the September morning together for a while in the easy silence of people who have nothing left to prove to each other and everything still to enjoy. 30 years, she said. More or less, he said. Do you ever think about New Mexico? She asked. He considered this with the seriousness he gave to questions that deserved it. No, he said. Not anymore. She looked at him. He was 61 years old and his hair was silver, and his hands were the hands of a man who had spent his life working with them, and he was looking at the morning with the direct and quiet attention that had been the first thing she understood about him, and was still the truest thing. Good, she said. The creek ran along the east side of the property in the morning light, catching the early sun in the way water catches light when it is moving over stones, brief flashes of brightness in the steady current. The cattle were moving in the south pasture, their shapes dark in the long morning shadows of the cottonwoods. A hawk was working a thermal above the west slope. The grass was silver with dew. 700 acres, 2 people, 3 children grown and living their own lives in the wide world. A house that had been expanded and repaired and settled into the ground over 30 years until it had the solidity of something that had always been there. And a deed in a document box in the bedroom that had brought her here. Lewis Barlow reached over and took her free hand in his, the way he had taken it on the porch all those years ago in the dark, with the ease of a gesture that had been made so many times it was simply part of how they moved through the world. His hand was warm. The morning opened ahead of them, September and clear and full of light, and the Texas grassland stretched to every horizon under the enormous and permanent sky, and it was home, entirely and completely home, in a way that a deed could record but never fully contain. She had come to claim a stranger's land. She had found, instead, her life. And she was, with her whole heart and the full weight of 30 years of honest days behind her and more years still ahead, exactly where she had always been meant to be.